December 16, 1944, early morning, Monschau, Germany. The frozen ground shuddered under yet another salvo of American artillery rumbling overhead. But this morning, something was different, terrifyingly, inexplicably different. The shells were not slamming into earth or trees. They were detonating in the air, directly above the advancing German positions, showering them with a lethal rain of steel fragments that no foxhole could stop. Among the men of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, attacking the positions of the 38th Cavalry Squadron, soldiers who had survived years on the Eastern Front suddenly faced something that lay beyond their understanding of war. These were not the artillery patterns they knew. No predictable impacts, no safe zones, no protection in trenches. This was death delivered from above with mathematical precision. At that moment, Colonel Oskar Axelson of the 406th Field Artillery Group made one of the most significant unauthorized decisions of the Battle of the Bulge. Defying orders and without higher approval, he instructed his gunners to load shells equipped with the most closely guarded secret in the Allied arsenal, the proximity fuse. These devices, containing miniature radar systems, could sense the distance to their targets and detonate at the optimal height, increasing artillery lethality by a factor of up to 50. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the mathematics of death were about to be rewritten. German soldiers had no way of knowing they were facing a weapon so revolutionary that it would change not only this battle, but the very nature of warfare. The storm had begun. Operation Wacht am Rhein launched with enormous hopes for the Wehrmacht. Hitler's last throw of the dice committed 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, all hidden in the misty Ardennes. The Führer promised his generals that this offensive would split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and reverse the tide of a war that was relentlessly sliding toward defeat. The initial barrage at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th achieved total tactical surprise. German artillery fired at a rate of 1,600 rounds per minute along an 85-mile front. American intelligence had failed catastrophically. They had missed the massive buildup. Many frontline units were either green replacements or exhausted veterans moved into this quiet sector to rest. But at Monschau, Colonel Axelson faced an impossible tactical situation. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, a small reconnaissance unit, was being overrun by superior German forces. Conventional artillery could not stop the attack. In desperation, Axelson made his historic choice to use the secret proximity-fuzed shells without authorization. He knew full well that he could face a court-martial later, but in that moment he understood that obeying orders meant certain defeat. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. German troops advancing in traditional battle formations suddenly found themselves under a kind of fire they had never seen. Shells were detonating 30-50 feet above them, each explosion creating a cone of fragments that covered far more area than ground bursts ever could. Veterans who knew exactly how to take cover from normal artillery died in their foxholes, behind trees, in ditches, everywhere they tried to hide. The proximity fuse was the fusion of American scientific innovation and industrial power at its absolute peak. Unlike standard shells, which required direct hits or time fuse that often detonated too high or too low, the proximity fuse contained an autonomous radar system no larger than a coffee tin. Inside each fuse, American engineers had crammed in 130 electronic components, including 4 or 5 miniature vacuum tubes, depending on the model, tubes that had to survive the unimaginable 20,000 G-forces generated when the shell was fired. The physics involved bordered on unbelievable. At the instant of firing, the acceleration crushed a glass ampule inside the fuse, releasing electrolyte and activating a battery that powered the tiny radar set for the duration of the shell's flight. Dr. Merle Tuve of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory led the development with an intensity on par with the Manhattan Project. The lab, disguised as an abandoned car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, at its peak, employed 3% of all physicists in the United States. Security matched that of the atomic bomb program. Workers could not discuss their jobs even with their families, and every fuse carried a unique serial number for tracking. The technical challenge seemed insurmountable. Vacuum tubes designed for living room radios had to be reinvented to survive artillery launch. They had to function at extreme spin rates, work in all weather, and be sensitive enough to detect targets without premature detonation. The breakthrough came through miniaturization techniques that would later revolutionize the entire electronics industry. Dr. James Van Allen's tubes were no bigger than pencil erasers, yet contained all the elements of a full-sized radio tube. By December 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuse a day. More than 100 companies contributed, from RCA and General Electric to Sylvania and Crossley Corporation. The program cost $1 billion in 1940s dollars, second only to the Manhattan Project in wartime expenditure. Axelson's unauthorized use on December 16th immediately triggered a command crisis. He had violated strict orders limiting proximity fuses to anti-aircraft use only, out of fear that captured specimens could be reverse-engineered by the Germans. But the destructive effect at Monschau was undeniable. The German assault was stopped with losses that shocked both sides. Reports of the weapon's impact reached Supreme Headquarters almost at once. General Eisenhower, fully aware of the worsening situation in the Ardennes, formally requested permission to use proximity fuses in ground combat on December 19th. By December 21st, all restrictions were lifted. The fuses were cleared for battlefield use across the Bulge. The speed of the subsequent distribution showcased American logistical superiority. Within days, proximity-fused shells were flowing into artillery units throughout the Ardennes. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne received its allotment just as the German ring closed around the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion began using them to defend the northwestern approaches. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit under Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, employed them with devastating effect southwest of Bastogne. Every unit discovered the same truth. Proximity fuses transformed artillery from a supporting arm into a decisive battlefield instrument. Forward observers no longer needed painstaking corrections. The fuse itself found the optimum detonation point. The requirement for pinpoint accuracy shrank, while lethality grew exponentially. The siege of Bastogne became the perfect laboratory for the defensive power of proximity fuses. The 101st Airborne Division, completely surrounded and outnumbered, held the vital crossroads against repeated German assaults. Their artillery support included the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 75mm howitzers capable of firing proximity-fused shells. From December 19th to 31, the 463rd fired exactly 7,776 rounds, according to official unit records. Not all used proximity fuses. The supply was limited, but those that did had devastating physical and psychological effects. German assault formations simply disappeared under airbursts. Entire platoons were wiped out in seconds. The attack on December 22nd, launched after General McAuliffe's famous one-word reply, "Nuts," to the German surrender demand, highlighted the weapon's impact. German infantry advancing across snow-covered fields in traditional formations were caught in the open. Proximity-fused shells detonated overhead with precise timing, creating overlapping patterns of destruction with no safe zones. The entirely African-American 969th Field Artillery Battalion played a crucial role as well. Their 155 Miller howitzers laid down a ring of death around the Bastogne perimeter that German forces could not break. The larger shells, bursting at 50 feet, covered enormous areas with lethal fragments. German prisoners later reported that assault units often disintegrated before reaching American lines as soldiers fled the incomprehensible airbursts. The massacre on the Sauer River. Perhaps the single best documented example of proximity-fuzed lethality came at the Sauer River near Echternach on December 25, 26. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was driving north to relieve Bastogne, personally observed the battle and recorded it in his memoir, War as I Knew It. A German battalion attempting to cross the partially frozen river believed darkness and fog shielded them from American observers. With conventional artillery, accurate fire would have required careful adjustment, giving the Germans time to complete their crossing or take cover. Proximity fuses erased that advantage. We caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer. The new type of ammunition was devastating. Shells burst in the air above them. There was nowhere to run. The river at their backs, our fire ahead and above. When the shooting stopped, we counted 702 bodies. That figure, 702 dead, physically counted, is one of the rare precisely documented casualty totals from proximity fuses. The mathematical efficiency was staggering. A single battalion ceased to exist within minutes, with no escape and no effective defense. The psychological shock rippled through German units in the sector. Soldiers reportedly refused orders to cross at that point again. The dense forests of the Ardennes, which the Germans had counted on for cover, became killing grounds once proximity fuses entered the equation. In open terrain, a 30-50-foot airburst was deadly enough. In the woods, effects multiplied. Airbursts shattered branches, turning them into thousands of additional wooden projectiles. Some splinters were as long as a man's arm, flying at hundreds of feet per second with lethal energy. Traditional defensive tactics, sheltering behind large trees, digging in beneath root systems, became useless. Shrapnel and splinters came from above, nullifying centuries of accumulated wisdom on forest combat. American artillerymen quickly recognized this multiplying effect. A single 150 mm shell with a proximity fuse detonating above the treetops could clear an area roughly the size of a tennis court of all living things. The combination of metal fragments from the shell and wooden splinters from the trees created a 360-degree kill zone that no clever tactic could avoid. German units trained in forest warfare found their experience meaningless. Dispersing to avoid concentrated casualties made them more vulnerable to wide-area bursts. Massing for mutual support meant whole squads could be erased by a single shell. There was no correct tactical answer to this new threat. The proximity fuse worked on principles that seemed like science fiction to 1940s soldiers. Each fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter operating between 180 and 220 MHz, continuously sending out waves that bounced off nearby objects, ground, trees, vehicles, human bodies. As the shell approached a target, the reflected signal grew stronger. When it reached a calibrated strength corresponding to the ideal detonation height, an electronic switch triggered the explosion. The entire system had to function in conditions that would destroy normal electronics. At firing, acceleration reached 20,000 gyro, enough to crush a human body to paper-thin paste. Shells spun at enormous speeds, creating immense centrifugal forces. Temperatures swung from the 3,000 degree off heat of the gun barrel to sub-zero air at the top of the trajectory. Yet the delicate vacuum tubes, cushioned by innovative shock mounts, survived and worked with better than 80% reliability. Extensive tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground established optimal detonation heights for 105mm howitzers, the standard divisional artillery piece, 30 feet. For 150mm guns, lethality peaked at 50 feet. Rare 200 pb shells produced devastating effects at heights above 70 feet, capable of clearing entire map squares of enemy infantry. This technological edge translated directly into battlefield dominance. Studies showed proximity fuses increased lethality 5 to 10-fold over conventional shells. The lethal fragment area expanded by a factor of 50. In anti-aircraft use, the improvement was even more dramatic. The success rate against V-1 flying bombs rose from 17% to 79% within weeks of deployment. German intelligence failure regarding the proximity fuse proved catastrophic. In December 1944, Wehrmacht troops captured an American ammunition dump containing roughly 20,000 proximity-fused shells. This should have led to immediate countermeasures. Instead, German technical experts examined the fuse and declared them impossible. The presence of vacuum tubes inside an artillery shell contradicted everything German engineers believed about electronics and ballistics. They concluded that the Americans must be using some form of magnetic sensing, or that the visible components were decoys hiding the real mechanism. This blindness was partly institutional. Germany had actually led in proximity fuse research before the war. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had working prototypes by 1940, but Hitler's order to halt all weapons projects that could not be fielded within 6 months killed the program. German engineers simply could not believe the Americans had solved problems they themselves had abandoned. The irony deepens considering German capabilities. Their electrostatic proximity fuses, using changes in electrical capacitance rather than radar, had shown 95% reliability in tests. Had development continued, Germany might have fielded proximity fuses by 1941. Hermann Göring later admitted under interrogation that German fuses were only 3 or 4 months from production when the war ended. December 25, 1944 brought no Christmas truce. German units attempting to use the holiday to resupply and regroup found that proximity fuses did not recognize holy days. Field kitchens, supply convoys, and assembly areas came under devastating fire that did not require forward observers. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion alone fired more than 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day, most of them with proximity fuses. Their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers delivered rapid, accurate fire that caught German units completely off guard. The ability to fire effectively without observation in bad weather and darkness turned artillery from a daytime arm into a 24-hour threat. The psychological impact was severe. German troops had learned to move in poor weather when Allied aircraft couldn't fly and observers couldn't see. Proximity fuses wiped out that refuge. Death could arrive at any moment, in any weather, with no warning beyond the brief scream of incoming shells. On December 21st, Colonel Otto Skorzeny's elite commandos attempted to seize Malmedy. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were the hand-picked troops who had rescued Mussolini, nearly captured Tito, and infiltrated American lines wearing U.S. uniforms. They represented some of the finest forces Germany could field. They ran headlong into devastating proximity-fused artillery fire that turned their American disguises from tactical assets into death shrouds. Shells detonated overhead with uncanny precision, as if they could sense the impostors below. While exact casualty figures remain debated, the attack ended in disaster, with losses that effectively ended Skorzény's offensive operations. The psychological collapse among elite SS troops was especially telling. These men, raised on the doctrine of German superiority and trained to the highest standards, found themselves utterly helpless before American technology. Some survivors reportedly sprinted directly toward American lines, preferring quick death to continued bombardment, an astonishing breakdown in discipline among Hitler's most fanatical troops. The production story behind proximity fuses rivaled any wartime industrial achievement. By December 1944, more than 100 American companies had converted to fuse manufacture. Crossley Corporation stopped making refrigerators and began assembling fuses. Emerson Radio refitted its plants from consumer electronics to weapons. Sylvania, RCA, and General Electric dedicated entire factories to the program. Quality control surpassed anything previously attempted in mass production. Each of the 130 components was individually tested. Every solder joint was inspected under magnification. Random samples were proof-fired to ensure they could survive combat conditions. Reject standards were ruthless. Any component with the slightest deviation was discarded. The workforce, largely women, maintained this precision while working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. Because of strict secrecy and compartmentalization, most had no idea what they were building, only that it mattered. By December 1944, they were producing one fuse every 2 seconds around the clock. The cost drop was astonishing. In 1942, a single fuse cost 732ers, more than a worker's yearly wage. By December 1944, mass production had cut that to $8 per unit without sacrificing quality. That efficiency made it possible to produce 22 million fuses during the war, of which around 200,000 were used in the Battle of the Bulge. General Patton understood the value of the fuse perhaps better than any other commander. His Third Army, driving toward Bastogne, used it as a breakthrough weapon. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Shy Williams, designed new tactics specifically for proximity fuses. Williams implemented time-on-target concentrations using the new shells, multiple battalions firing so that their shells arrived simultaneously. When dozens of shells detonated at optimal height at the same moment, the effect was annihilating. German soldiers called it the death knell barrage. In the week from December 27 to 29, Patton's Third Army fired 50,000 proximity-fused shells. The results were decisive in breaking German resistance and opening the corridor to Bastogne. Patton himself remarked, "That funny fuse has won us the Battle of the Bulge." The Battle of Elsenborn Ridge showcased the fuse at maximum effect. There, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held key high ground against the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Over 3 days, December 17th, 19, American artillery fired 160,000 rounds, about 40,000 of them with proximity fuses. Those 25% of shells produced roughly 60% of the more than 5,000 German casualties. The arithmetic was undeniable. The fuses effectively quadrupled American firepower. German attacks, launched repeatedly up steep wooded slopes, ran into walls of exploding steel suspended in midair. Entire companies vanished in seconds, bodies piling so densely that later waves had to climb over their own dead. After 3 days, the attacks stopped. The elite SS formations were shattered by American technology. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, sending 900 fighters to attack Allied airfields. The surprise was total. Many Allied aircraft were caught on the ground. But as the German pilots returned, they met walls of flak armed with proximity fuses. Of the 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 were shot down by anti-aircraft guns, mostly using the new fuses. The loss rate stunned both sides. German pilots trained to dodge conventional flak found shells bursting exactly where they would do the most damage. The already weakened Luftwaffe never recovered from these losses. By early January 1945, secrecy was no longer sustainable. Too many shells had been fired. Too many soldiers were talking. On January 6th, the War Department authorized limited disclosure. The New York Times reported a new artillery shell that greatly increased American firepower without explaining the technology. German intelligence finally grasped the significance of the weapon. Too late. A January 10th report from Foreign Armies West stated, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse which detonates shells at the optimum height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused severe casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist." Post-war analysis confirmed the fuse's decisive impact. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated, "The fuse was decisive. Our attacks failed not because of American bravery, though they fought well, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, testified, "American artillery was a horror to our troops, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. They caused panic even among veteran soldiers." The numbers speak plainly. Roughly 200,000 proximity-fused shells were fired in the Ardennes, causing an estimated 15,000–20,000 German casualties, up to 20% of total German losses in the battle. The weapon achieved 5 to 10-fold greater effectiveness than standard shells, and often did not require observed fire in poor weather. Behind every statistic lies human tragedy. German soldiers, many of them teenagers conscripted in the final phase of the war, died in ways traditional warfare had never envisioned. They were killed by weapons that seemed almost intelligent, able to find them wherever they hid. American factory workers paid their own price. Accidents on fuse production lines went unreported for security reasons. Workers at Crossley, Emerson, and other plants suffered breakdowns from stress and exhaustion. They built weapons of unprecedented lethality without knowing what they truly were, carrying that burden in enforced silence. Yet the moral calculus of wartime is never simple. The Battle of the Bulge cost 19,000 American lives. Without proximity fuses, how many more would have died? How much longer might the war have dragged on? How many additional victims of the Holocaust might have perished while the fighting continued? Every day the fuse shaved off the length of the war potentially saved thousands of people in camps waiting for liberation. The fuse program spawned advances that transformed post-war technology. Miniaturized vacuum tubes became the basis of modern electronics. Quality control procedures developed for fuse production became industry standards. Organizational techniques coordinating hundreds of suppliers laid the groundwork for modern supply chain management. Dr. James Van Allen applied his miniaturization expertise to satellite instruments, later discovering the Earth's radiation belts. Radar principles matured into modern systems. The concept of autonomous sensors making their own decisions became the foundation for guided missiles and, eventually, all smart weapons. Every precision-guided weapon today traces its lineage back to the proximity fuse, the first munition able to sense its environment and choose when to detonate. The revolution that began in the Ardennes continues on modern battlefields dominated by smart weapons. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945, with German forces in retreat. Hitler's final offensive had cost Germany around 100,000 casualties and achieved nothing. American losses totaled some $75,000, including 19,000 killed. The proximity fuse proved itself not just as another weapon, but as a war winner. Eisenhower's later assessment that German possession of such fuses might have made the Normandy landings extremely difficult, perhaps impossible, captures their strategic weight. This was not a mere refinement of artillery, it was a revolutionary technology that fundamentally changed the arithmetic of war. German soldiers facing proximity-fused artillery experienced something unprecedented. Death delivered by shells that seemed to think that could find them anywhere, that turned the air itself into a killing zone. Their suffering marked the transition of warfare into the technological age. From Axelson's unauthorized first use on December 16, 1944, to the systematic firing of 200,000 shells across the Ardennes, proximity fuses demonstrated that scientific innovation could provide a decisive military edge. The fusion of American industrial capacity, scientific genius, and tactical adaptation created a weapon that helped decide the outcome of the war. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately a story of transformation, technological, tactical, and human. It proved that an industrial democracy could produce weapons of overwhelming effectiveness, that innovation could overcome numerical inferiority, that the side with superior science would likely prevail. Those lessons shaped not just the rest of World War II, but the entire structure of the wars that followed. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the era of technological warfare truly arrived. The mathematics of death were rewritten by tiny radar sets inside artillery shells, forever changing the way humans wage war. German soldiers killed under those airbursts were casualties not only of a particular battle, but of a revolution in the conduct of war that still shapes our world today.